So today we're going to be talking about acids and bases and trying to differentiate the various types of theories that go into explaining why an acid-base reaction occurs and how we can sort of try to explain the different types of theories behind different types of acid and base reactions. The simplest one is an arrhenius acid-base reaction, and here's an example of the following. Arrhenius acids obviously are ones that produce hydrogen ions in aqueous solution, and the two things to notice here are both the hydrogen ions and the fact that it has to happen in water. Now there's two reactions that are actually one and the same written right here. You'll notice in the first reaction we start with hydrochloric gas or hydrogen chloride. We react it with water. And it turns out that when HCl reacts with water, we do produce a hydrogen ion and a chloride ion. You can effectively think of these two ions being split apart from the original HCl molecule. But in reality, we have water actually attracting the hydrogen ion from the hydrogen chloride molecule to produce something different. It's not just a proton, it's a hydronium ion. Hydronium ions are a little better representation of what really is going on in an acidic solution. Nevertheless, we still have the same chloride ion just like we did before. In both of these cases, we're going to be considering this an acid because when you place a molecule like HCl in water, an aqueous solution, we get a proton, and that's what we're looking for to be defining an arrhenius acid. An arrhenius base, on the other hand, is something that produces hydroxide ions. Hydroxide ions are going to be produced, if you look back to the simplest example of sodium hydroxide. Just like before with HCl, we take this original molecule and we can imagine it being dissociated into two respective ions. So in this case, the sodium ion dissolves in water, and the hydroxide ion, which is what we're looking for, is produced in aqueous solution. Again, an arrhenius substance, whether it's an acid or base, is taking presence in water. In this case, we produce not a hydrogen, but a hydroxide ion, and hydroxide ions are what we're looking for to be called an arrhenius base. It turns out that you can have acid-base reactions occurring, though, outside of just water. We'll continue on with this next type of theory with acids in a moment. First, I want to just review how this could potentially work and try to give yourself a minute or two and look at these different examples. Go ahead and work out the first one. The name of this is nitric acid. You may have already known that it was an acid. Again, we have it associating in water. You can imagine water looking something like this and having its lone pairs of electrons attracting this hydrogen molecule. If that's the case, the resulting ions that we form are a hydronium ion and a nitrate anion. That certainly would be considered an acid because we've produced a hydronium ion or the proton, if you think of it that way. Second example of a substance is going to be again splitting and ionizing, dissociating into barium ions and hydroxide ions. The thing to notice here is that we actually have two molecules of hydroxide in the reactants. In this case, we produce two hydroxide ions in the products to keep things equal. Both of these obviously are again an aqueous solution. Next example, you can again try to figure out what's going on here. Is this an acid? Is this a base? Ammonia, for those of you that may remember this in cleaning solutions, is going to be considered a weak base. This is a reaction that would proceed such that if it's a base, we need to produce hydroxide ions. Well, the only way you could do that is if you took one of these hydrogen ions and actually ended up getting it donated onto the original ammonia. The result of that is that we produce an ammonium ion in solution. Again, this is what's making this considered an arrhenius base because we're producing hydroxides, not an acid. The last one is carbonic acid, and we're going to see that even though there are two protons potentially to be donated, only the first association will occur readily. This is a weak acid, and so we'll end up producing a hydronium ion in aqueous solution, as well as the bicarbonate ion, which will look something like this. 3 examples The first two are considered acids, the second two are considered bases. A bronsted-lowry acid and base are going to be something that look very similar to what we just talked about with an arrhenius acid and base. The difference is really in the bases. In the first example, we've got nitric acid again in the presence of water, and we're going to obviously produce a hydronium ion in aqueous solution, as well as the nitrate ion. The production of this, the proton, or as we can think of this as the hydronium ion, is what indicates something to be considered a bronsted-lowry acid. You might be saying to yourself, this is no different than an arrhenius acid, and you'd be right. For all intents and purposes, a bronsted-lowry acid and a arrhenius acid produce a molecule that looks identical. The difference, though, is the wording. Notice that this produces a proton, and there's no suggestion about whether or not it occurs in aqueous medium. It doesn't actually have to happen that way. This doesn't have to take place in water, although in our example here, this is. The fundamental difference between an arrhenius acid and a bronsted-lowry, an arrhenius base and a bronsted-lowry base is going to be the product in this case. By an arrhenius base, we were saying it had to produce a hydroxide ion in solution. And as you'll notice, it's not talking about hydroxide at all. It's simply saying that a bronsted-lowry base is something that actually receives the hydronium ion or the proton. In this case, we've got potassium hydroxide and hydrochloric acid reacting. And if we can break this apart a little bit, we can think of the molecule looking something like this and something like this. Now, in solution, we have actually potassium ions and hydroxide ions, as well as hydrogen ions and chloride ions. In a general reaction, this molecule is going to be considered the base because it will be accepting the proton from HCl. As we do that, you'll notice what we're going to be forming is water, and the resulting anion from the acid and the cation from the base will form our salt, potassium chloride. Potassium chloride obviously is going to be soluble in water, both because of the group 1 metal and the chloride ion present. The key thing here is to notice that it wasn't because the fact that a hydroxide ion was produced, but simply because this is considered a base because it can accept a proton. Lewis acids and bases cover a much broader range of acid-base reactions than either the Bronsted-Lowry or the Arrhenius acid and base theory. Particularly, we can think of this reaction to help us understand exactly what is going on with electron donation and acception. Lewis acids, the third type of acid, even though these are all the same substances, is simply going to be defined as something that can accept a pair of electrons. It might make more sense to just draw this out in terms of its Lewis structure. Ammonia looks something like this, with a lone pair of electrons on the central nitrogen atom. Hydrogen chloride, or hydrochloric acid, this is hydrogen chloride as it's a gas, looks something like this. The Lewis acid is simply the one that's going to be accepting the pair of electrons. And if you look around, the pretty obvious answer is that right here is going to be the only lone pair of electrons, the only electrons available really to be donated. All the rest of the electrons are locked into the individual covalent bonds. What can happen in this reaction is that the lone pair of electrons can try to form a bond with the hydrogen atom on the HCl. The electrons can then be donated back to chloride, and what we get in this reaction is now going to be an ammonium ion, which will have 4 hydrogens bonded to the central nitrogen atom. This will carry a positive charge simply because it was initially neutral. We added 1 proton with a +1 charge. That's why we get this structure. The other piece we're going to be getting, obviously, is the remaining chloride ion. Again, why is this the Lewis base? Well, it wasn't written, but we can think of that Lewis bases donate a pair of electrons, while the Lewis acid here is accepting them. That covers a short introduction to Lewis acids and bases, and we'll be moving on to more reactions very shortly.